Leaders wrapping up a tour of Europe with a historic visit to Brussels, the very heart of the EU. And the president has been enjoying a major charm offensive along the way. Xi Jinping's warm welcome comes as Europe strives to increase its links with the Asian giant, while at the same time considering placing sanctions against Russia, one of its biggest other trading partners. RT's Alexei Yerashevsky explains now why Beijing wins on both accounts.
In the last several weeks, the word sanctions has dominated all Russia-related news.
Every member of the G7 has imposed sanctions.
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 We make sure that unacceptable actions will bear very serious consequences.
So far, the sanctions of the EU and the US have been personal, frozen assets of certain Russians and visa bans. But talk of wider economic sanctions has been circulating. So who actually stands to win and lose if the West decides to go further? Let's take a look using the example of the world's most ancient game, chess. Let's imagine the EU moves to impose trade sanctions. But that does little to frighten Moscow, which could just castle, in other words, moving the king away from the threat. It said if Europe blocks oil and gas deals, the most sensitive area of business, Russia would instead look to the superpower on its eastern border, China. So where does this leave Europe? Should it escalate sanctions, its trade turnover with Russia of more than $400 billion would be plunged into doubt. Losses like that are difficult to alleviate, so Europe would then have to strengthen trade ties with, guess who? China. Trade already stands at more than $500 billion a year. So EU here finds itself trapped on the board, giving the advantage to China while failing to punish Russia. In a nutshell, if the EU fails to think ahead in the game, it might lose strategically in the end, even despite making the first move.
The attempts to build on relations with China means traditional criticism of Beijing's human rights record is getting far less attention than usual. RT's Peter Oliver has more.
Smiles and handshakes all round. That's what greeted Chinese President Xi Jinping on his first official visit to Europe. The welcome in Berlin, a repeat of scenes in Paris just days earlier. With European governments like the one here in Germany cozying up to Chinese industry, does this suggest that they're a little concerned that the ongoing dispute between themselves and Russia over the situation in Ukraine could come back to bite European countries in the bank balance?
Sanctions and this whole uproar over Crimea is simply foolishness on the part of the EU, but the EU has nothing to gain by sanctions on Russia.
The EU is considering sanctions, knowing that financially they could end up shooting themselves in the foot. So they aren't in the mood to criticise cash cow China too much over long-standing human rights allegations.
The EU further calls upon the Chinese authorities to ensure that all human rights of all minorities are respected.
Germany continues to be worried about human rights violations in China.
The world will be looking at China to a greater extent than it has in past years, and people will also be looking at how China presents itself in terms of freedom of speech and freedom of the press.
Now, though, they're happy to let the business of doing business take centre stage. Europe's realpolitik has a very short memory. Peter Oliver, RT, Berlin.
China is such an attractive prospect because it's expected to become the world's biggest economy in less than 5 years. Its growth rate is slowing a little, but it remains well ahead of everyone else's. The host of Venture Capital, Katie Pilbeam, explains why China is a key player.
The Chinese economy has come a long way since being one of the poorest countries in the world back in 1978. Now, fast forward more than 3 decades, and China is the second biggest economy in the world. Now, since then, China has overtaken Europe's powerhouse, Germany, as you'll be able to see. Now, it did this by reforming, including mass privatizations, the opening up of the country to foreign investment, impressive production rates, and cheap labour helped them achieve this figure just here. China is now the world's largest trading nation. This happened in 2013. It was a title that was taken by the US for decades. Now, as we can see, EU exports to China have now reached a record, almost 150 billion. Now, these products, they're mainly machinery and equipment. We've got motor vehicles, aircraft and chemicals as well. Now, it works both ways. China is the EU's biggest supplier too, with just shy of 280 billion just there. Now, EU imports from China are dominated by industrial and consumer goods. We've got machinery, equipment, footwear, they love their clothing as well, furniture, electricals, and of course toys too. China buys up German cars in their thousands. China is the biggest market for economy cars, such as Volkswagen, a recent deal of 18.2 billion just there. As for Russia, trade between the two has been escalating, and last summer a multi-billion-dollar deal was signed to supply China with fuel for 25 years. In money terms, that equates to $270 billion. And with the threat of sanctions from the West, the business relationship between Russia and China has never been so crucial. And geographically, well, it makes sense because, of course, the two share a border. China is already the second largest importer of Russian goods, second to Europe. Now, by 2018, China is predicted to become the world's biggest economy. And with this title here comes huge political power.